For the longest time, Pure Fiction has had the reputation for being the easiest game moder, something you shouldn't really concern yourself about. But I believe a lot of that reputation is undue, especially in today's environment. For the longest time I've asked myself, is the new version of Pure Fiction really all that much better? Part of me likes the added consistency and the new grit mechanics, but at the same time, Pure Fiction's uniform structure, along with ever-increasing HP thresholds, means that the meta has started to centralize over time to what I honestly consider a wholly unhealthy degree at this point. But if we're going to talk about the centralization of Pure Fiction, there needs to be a clearly defined center. And that center, to I hope absolutely no one's surprise, is the Herta. In order to understand why the Herta is so dominant though, let's first look at Pure Fiction's current enemy layout. 5 enemies are present on field at all times. For Wave 1, that's your typical fodder mobs, along with the occasional trash can who is noticeably bulkier, but instantly dies if his 60 toughness bar is broken. Each mob kill depletes 5% of the wave's HP, meaning that you need to wipe out 20 mobs, or 4 AoE waves, to win. Waves 2 and 3, on the other hand, have a central enemy that needs to be killed in order to pass the wave. For Wave 2, that's a decently tanky elite, and for Wave 3, an insanely bulky boss that can't be killed through single target brute forcing alone. Usually. Here, each mob defeated depletes 3% of the elite's max HP, and this leads to some pretty interesting math. Against the stronger mobs, this would usually translate to dealing 82.5% of their max HP, meaning that you lose about a fifth of your damage if you were to target them instead of the elite. However, versus weaker mobs, that 3% elite or boss max HP could be anywhere from 110% to 177% of their max HP, meaning that you could multiply their effective damage from 10 to 77% if you targeted them instead of the big bad. Of course, this multiplier assumes two things. First, that you don't deal any overkill damage, so in reality it's usually a bit lower per mob. Second, that you target the mob instead of the boss or elite. So taken across all 4 mobs that are always present, this multiplier for AoE units actually becomes a lot higher. In fact, it's comparable to shared HP, except it's more efficient so long as your overkill isn't ridiculously high, and you also get 5 energy per mob killed, for a total of 20 energy per wave. This is why Erudition is so strong in today's Pure Fiction. It's a special form of shared HP endgame that is perfectly designed to favor their damage profile. This brings us to the 2 main archetypes for AoE damage dealers that excel in Pure Fiction: pure AoE units and AoE units with a single target focus. Pure AoE units tend to have a lot of frequent attacks like 4-star Herta, Himiko, Argenti, Jade, and even Hyacine, avoiding overkill through dealing chip damage in lots of tiny but frequent increments. Funny enough, Anaxa, despite generally not being crazy good in Pure Fiction, fits this role to a T, since the uniquely low priority of his extra skill means that he always hits 5 targets no matter what. AoE units with single target focus, on the other hand, are the heavy hitters of Pure Fiction, dealing with overkill simply by focusing more of their damage on the main boss. These are your Thurdas, your Acherons, your Rappas, sorta, your Castorisses. Heck, even Saber, E1 Mighty, and Dot as of right now fit pretty well in this role. And somewhere in the middle, on the more supportive but DPS in disguise end, we have Tribbie and Linksha. While they do have single target focus damage baked into their kits, their attacks are so frequent that they tend to behave like pure AoE units in practice. Actually, while we're still focused on Tribbie, let's talk about the difference between her E1 and S1. Let's just get this out of the way right now. Tribbie's E1 is much stronger. The ability to not just double dip on side mob damage being converted to the main enemy, but also convert overkill damage is stupid strong. In practice, this lets pure AoE units deal 220% or more of their original damage to the bulky Wave 2 or 3 target, or whatever poor Wave 1 mob happens to have the highest HP at the time. Keep in mind that trash can kill damage is also added to the E1 tally, even if you kill them by breaking. And while your AoE Nukers technically shouldn't be dealing 220% of their original damage to the main target, due to their single target focused damage distribution, their high amount of overkill means that it usually translates to a similar, if not larger, increase anyways. But Tribbie's S1 is no slouch either. Despite being so strong for Pure Fiction due to its single target focus, Tribbie's E1 barely contributes to your team's adjacent AoE damage. Her S1, however, certainly does. Not only is it an insane stat stick for herself and a 48% crit damage buff for her allies, but it also allows her to spam her AoE ultimates, and by extension her AoE follow-ups at a much faster rate. And with her DPS being not exactly insignificant, this makes it easier to kill squishier side mobs, giving her and the team more kill energy, grit, and depending on the DPS, more damage focus. To go more into what damage focus means exactly, let's start with Acheron as an example. Against 5 enemies, her ult will deal 372% attack to the main enemy and 300% attack to all others, followed by a 6-hit single target bounce for a total of 150% attack. If you're able to kill all the side mobs with her ult, a threshold that Tribbie's S1 massively helps with, then that translates to a whopping 522% attack on the main target, or about a 1.4 times increase. However, should Acheron's AoE portion of her ult fail to kill all the side mobs, the most likely outcome is that only 1 or 2 of those 6 bounces will actually land on the primary boss target, cutting her single target damage output by 24 to 32% on average. The same scenario applies to Casterus, whose Netherwing actually deals 240% HP as 6 single target bounces, or slightly over double her AoE scaling when factoring in her ramping damage percent boost. This means that only landing 1 to 2 bounces on the main enemy slashes her single target output down 44 to 55% from what it could have been, though ideally she has not just Tribbie, but also Hyacine, plus her AoE sideswipe at E2 and up, so it's less and less of a problem for her if Tribbie is Sigless the more you invest in the Casterus overall. But easily the worst single target falloff in this category is Saber, who is a whopping 10-hit bounce with a total of 1100% attack scaling, compared to a respectable, but still relatively small 280% AoE. Causing even 1 bounce to be wasted per trash mob already cuts her single target scaling by 40%. But if she has to spend 2 bounces on each mob, then that's a 64% damage decrease, assuming the most likely outcome of 2 bounces per target. All of this is to say that there is significant single target value to Tribbie's S1, not just for clearing Wave 1 trash mobs, but also for meeting Wave 2 and 3 mob kill breakpoints. Sure, even these extreme cases lose to E1's game warping generally over double single target amp, but as a young girl once said, why not both? But of course, single target wasn't always the name of the game. In fact, it was the antithesis of what pure fiction was when it first started. To understand exactly how we got to the point where such high single target amping in an AoE mode of all places started becoming normalized, let's take a retrospective and dive back into pure fiction's initial debut, all the way back in 1.6. Pure fiction's first iteration looked almost nothing like how we know it to be today. Besides the absence of grid mechanics, even the enemy layouts were different. One side would always have a maximum of 4 enemies on field, while the other would always have 5. Additionally, rather than enemies constantly respawning, there was a set number of enemies you had to kill per wave, sometimes resulting in scenarios where only 1 enemy would be left on field. For Wave 1, that enemy quota would be 12 mobs and 1 elite, Wave 2 would have 12 mobs and 2 trotters, and Wave 3 had 24 mobs along with a boss, who needed to be the last one standing before being killed, but received a massive vulnerability buff upon meeting that condition. This means that as long as you had a few turns left over, pretty much any team can kill it with whatever HP remained by then. In practice, this meant that you needed a minimum of 3 or 4 AoEs to kill Wave 1, 3 or 4 AoEs for Wave 2, and 6 or 8 AoEs to finish Wave 3, plus finishing off the boss. With HP values being as low as they were all around at the time, this allowed the frequently attacking pure AoE units to shine, easily meeting the massive 12 to 16 AoE minimum per wave while not being hindered by their low damage output. Though realistically, with the 1 elite in Wave 1 being as tanky as it was compared to the mobs, it usually wouldn't die until the rest of the wave did, increasing the Wave 1 AoE count to 4 or 6, making the true AoE minimum closer to 13 or 18, depending on which side you selected. Adding to the difference in performance between sides was another certain fact. All pure AoE units at this time scaled with the number of enemies they could hit. Herta gets 1 AoE follow-up per half-health enemy, Himiko gets 1 per 3 enemy toughness stars broken, and her ult refunds additional energy per enemy killed. Serval, who's a bit more in the middle ground, nevertheless gains energy per shocked enemy hit, and Argenti gains energy per enemy spawn and enemy hit. Not to mention that killing less enemies at once meant less kill energy to loop your AoE ults with. Even someone like Blade, though, whose follow-ups are pure AoE, benefits from multiple enemies on field to charge his HP loss-based follow-up attacks faster. This naturally created an easier and harder side, as the 5 enemies per field side was much more conducive to continuous AoE snowballing than the 4 side and took less AoEs to kill. Seems like this lopsided difficulty wasn't exactly the plan though, and 2.0 would see both Wave 3 sides having 5 enemies on field at once. Cirrus would also make an appearance for this rotation, allowing for a true 5 enemy AoE for Wave 3 as a uniquely off-field boss, who pure AoE units heavily enjoyed fighting. That being said, we would actually never see Cirrus again. Rest in peace. In fact, 2.1 would heavily roll back on the low HP AoE portion, favoring more single-target capable teams. For Wave 1, 4 mobs were removed and replaced with 1 more elite. Wave 2 removed 2 mobs, and Wave 3 cut 6 mobs for a whopping 3 more elites. That being said, this didn't make our pure AoE units less popular. No, quite the opposite. Being an effective AoE sub-DPS that could chain attacks off of stronger single-target and blast units was quite the strength, and the dual DPS model was legitimately strong for pure fiction, demonstrated with even comps like Blade Leo doing pretty decent during this time. And well, between the shatter and follow-up damage blessings at this period, you didn't even really need a single target unit. Pure Fiction itself helped out with your single target. That being said, the decreased AoE amount certainly helped Acheron, who released his patch and had insane AoE plus single target focused nukes, but at a much less frequent pace. And of course, the introduction of Robin in 2.2 helped this team comp quite a bit. Not only was her amp AoE and massive, but her additional damage procs per attack put in quite a lot of work too, and helped compensate for any potential single target the team lacked. Plus, between Pure Fiction naturally favoring attack spam, enemies respawning 70% advance forward for more hit energy, and Robin occasionally taking kills herself, maintaining good ult uptime on her wasn't particularly difficult, even back then. That being said, a new queen of Pure Fiction was about to arrive, and with her, a return to the old 12-12-24 mob spam Pure Fiction structure. I'm of course talking about rerunning it's Jade, it's freaking Jade. Even disregarding the massive decrease in elites, HP values per mob plummeted with Jade's arrival going from 2.1 and 2.2. Technically, Wave 3 mobs were made slightly tankier, but when you remove the elites from the equation, yeah, everything feels a lot squishier. This, of course, made Jade and Argenti a lot more powerful, as not having to deal with elites helped them spam follow-ups and ults to their heart's content. But you know who else can spam follow-ups and ults? That's right, Herta and Himiko. The fact that Fire Week stages continue to be present in this Pure Fiction cycle ensured that Himiko would never let the enemies get away. And even with ice-resistant stages, Herta was still doing Herta things against the hordes of mobs. The replacement of Trotters with 30 toughness trash cans also meant that just about anyone with frequent enough AoE could just kill them regardless of damage. Such a situation meant that while Argenti and Jade were acknowledged as the king and queen of Pure Fiction, they weren't seen as necessary additions to the roster. This, however, was quickly about to change. 2.5 and 2.6 returned to the elite-filled structure of Pure Fiction, but this time with 4 enemies on both sides of Pure Fiction. Sure, having 5 enemies on both sides of Wave 3 was nice for pure AoE units, but have fun staring down 3 elites. Especially when those elites were Shells of Fated Rage. With 60% damage reduction while not broken, these dinos effectively had 360,000 HP on Wave 1 and 818k HP in Wave 3 if you didn't break them. It didn't help that their weaknesses were lightning, quantum, and imaginary either. No fire for Himiko, no ice for Herta. Sure, the blessing making all ults Omni Break helped a little bit, but the non-limited Eruditions and honestly even Argenti couldn't do much on their own. The only appropriate Omni Breaker was Fei Xiao, the hottest new unit at the time, and let's just say that while she was indeed strong, the idea of Hunt doing well in Pure Fiction of all places at this time was still widely considered laughable. Even on Element, Acheron and Jingyuan still took a while to deplete the Dino's 60 toughness, especially with their usual teammates being unable to help. Well, everyone except for Jiao Cho, that is. That being said, without him, your best bet in that department was your sustain, either being Aventurine, Fu Xuan, or Luocha, who, to be fair, all put in a good amount of work. And obviously, not many people were using Sela and Xue Yi, though for those that knew how to pilot them against the dinos, they were usually rewarded with decent to high scores, especially when paired with Ronbei or Robin. And Imaginary, sure, Harmony MC exists, but the rest of the stage's weakness sides were not kind of Firefly, and you'd much rather use both of them on the other side anyways. implanting fire weakness doesn't do much if you're only killing 1 to 2 mobs at a time without adjacent fire weakness anyways. That just left Jade as the one well-known and dominant counter versus these safeguarded shells, and dominate she did. Even Rappa, the imaginary AoE who arrived at the tail end of this pure fiction, just couldn't match Jade's overwhelming performance, actually performing on par with Himiko at the highest level. This dominance continued into the next rotation, which has gone down in infamy as a DOT pure fiction that was actually a massive pain for DOT characters. Advancing enemies to take DOTs faster usually meant taking massive dots and AoE outrages on Brania's side, or facing imprisons and freezes on Yensheng's side. If you just looked at the lineup, this was very much an anti-DOT pure fiction. It was the AoE units that didn't let enemies take too many turns, like Jade and Rappa, or the ones that instantly ended enemies upon taking their turns, like Acheron with Zhao Cho, that truly ruled this rotation. When one of the blessings turns every ult into a Kafka detonation too, turns out that having a dedicated detonator slot, aka Kafka, isn't quite all that necessary, especially considering this is her pre-buff version with single target detonation skills. However, not all hope was lost. Right after the misery that was DOT Pure Fiction was 2.7, where we received the new grid style of Pure Fiction we all know today. Finally, all 3 waves would always have 5 enemies. Elites would be capped to a single enemy on wave 2, and you could kill it and the boss directly to end the wave early. Plus, a fire and ice weak stage. Herta was so back. Not to mention that grit buffs themselves' rotations were really OP. 40% ramping skill damage, ult damage, and speed, plus not consuming SP was already broken as it was, but Surge and Grit also provided essentially a Robin ult to the whole team. And if you really tried, you could proc it twice in the 0 cycle. With enemies also taking 50% more damage during the Surge and Grit period, along with the fact that mob HP actually decreased across the board compared to the Elite Slogfest 2 rotations ago, and yeah, this rotation was probably one of, if not the easiest ones we've had to date. Heck, I 0 cycled it with Qingxue. Freaking Qingxue! But if you've been paying attention, easy rotations are usually a sign of harder things to come. Especially because that's when Hoyo likes to release their strongest AoE units. The start of Pure Fiction had Argenti, the 2.3 to 2.4 lull had Jade, and now, going into 3.0, we had none other than the genius Madame herself. The one, the only, the Herta. And Pure Fiction was quick to respond. The next Pure Fiction, 3.1, saw an insane rise in overall mob HP, with wave 3 mobs in particular shooting up from 155 to 235k HP all the way up to 230k to almost 400k HP. Sure, both of these mobs had beneficial on-death mechanics. The Bubble Hounds inflicted 4% max HP bleeds to adjacent enemies, which, when killing mobs dealt 3% of the boss's max HP already, was quite noticeable. And on the other side, killing the Honored Shield provided a permanent, stackable 20% damage boost to the killer. But in order to consistently land said bleeds, and to really capitalize on the ramping damage boosts, you already had to be winning hard in the first place, since non-AoEs would just have the outside dog's bleeds usually whiff on adjacent trash mobs, or ramp up damage too late to actually do anything with it. Combined with the fact that the new 40% speed buff didn't grant bonus damage or unlimited SP, just 1 SP per every 10 kills, plus the new Surge and Grit being a damage proc rather than the full team action advance, yeah. If you weren't a limited Erudition, you were most likely getting your socks rocked, or at least seeing a massive drop in score. And with this patch running the Herta, while simultaneously rerunning Jade and Lingsha, aka both of these two's best sustain, the message could not have been any clearer. If you want to stay doing well in Pure Fiction, pull strong AoE. Mob HP was skyrocketing, and if you weren't willing to invest in the premium answers, well then, you'd probably experience the crash of 2.5 and 2.6 once again. And compared to back then, at least Hoyo was actually doing the player base somewhat of a favor, if you want to frame it that way, by dropping the AoE answers on the patch that they increased the AoE requirement, instead of one patch later like they did with Jade. And well, if you somehow missed the Herta, her DLC was in the very next patch, and turns out she's a great AoE enabler on her own too. Accompanying Tribbie was yet another hike in enemy HP, but also in case the message wasn't clear enough, they brought AoE into both MOC and Apocalyptic Shadow too. For MOC, True Sting, Nikador, and Flame Reaver, and for Apocalyptic Shadow, Scarasabaz and Banana Academics. Seems like Pure Fiction had developed such a joke reputation within the player base that Hoyo apparently decided it was time to bring it into all 3 endgame modes. Seriously, if you think about it, 4 of these 5 examples rely on killing summons to deal more damage to the main boss, and in doing so reward AoE with single target focus. All 5 favor AoE Nukers. And that brings us to today. While Pure Fiction HP did see another spike in 3.3 with Hyoscene's rerun, enabling Pure Fiction Casterus, like how Jiao Cho did with Pure Fiction Acheron, and with the Herta's rerun, it's actually somewhat calmed down today in 3.4, though the Wave 3 mob enemy's HP has exceeded that of the hardest elites of the old Pure Fiction, which is a crazy stat to think about. There is more difficulty definitely right now, but it's more so due to the grit buffs being lackluster, and Surging Grid itself much harder to proc for non-DOT teams. And, well, Kafka and Hyslins are out now if you really need that DOT shield right now, though I would never suggest basing your pulls around like 800 Jades. So why go through this whole retrospective? Why look at what Pure Fiction used to be like all the way up until today? How does any of this history point towards the Herta centralizing spot in the meta? Well, for the longest time, Pure Fiction was seen as a joke of an endgame mode. If you were a good AoE unit, in fact, you were often branded as a Pure Fiction slave by some. What was Hoyo's solution to this? Well, I can't exactly read their minds, but I can look back and see what they've tried. Pure Fiction started out as a half-hearted attempt to favor AoE. In the process of evolving the game mode, it's become both more single-target focused and more AoE focused at times. Single-target focus and bulking enemy HP have been generally successful at pushing the highest performing limited eruditions to the top, while AoE focuses and lowering enemy HP actually return the advantage to the non-limited eruditions. Now, if you're Hoyo, and you have all this information available to you, with your goal to give limited erudition specifically a place in the meta regarding Pure Fiction, since after all Single Target and Blast already dominate Apocalyptic Shadow and MOC anyways. What do? That's right, turn Pure Fiction into a 4 elite 1 boss game mode. What's more, keep Wave 1 as mob spam to prevent Single Target and Blast cheese, and store lots of HP in the Wave 2 and 3 big bads, so that neither type of unit can brute force past a shared HP mechanic without ridiculous vertical investment, and still they usually need AoE help anyways. After all, when even trash mobs start getting tanky, what happens? Well, if you see an Apocalyptic Shadow Scarasabaz, it's simple. Forced AoE Nukers. And what's more, I've been contrasting pure AoE and AoE with single target focus this whole time when the truth is, well, they couldn't be more perfect to pair with each other. The Herta pairs excellently with Jade, Mini Herta, and even Argenti, capable, spammy AoE damage dealers that can clear out weaker early waves and build up energy for massive Thirda nukes. Rappa and Lingsha are much the same, with Lingsha also breaking lots of enemies, especially enabled with Fugue, to build up nuke stacks for Rappa's enhanced basics. As for Acheron, her supports enable her to do a bit of both. Jiao Cho and Cypher for frequent ults to wave clear, and Cypher and Silverwolf for harder single target nuking potential. And for everyone else, say hello to 2 very familiar characters, Hyoscene and Tribbie. I do actually think that Wheelchair as a concept has been pretty overrated on the whole. Especially in single target scenarios, Tribbie lacks the energy regen, especially without her S1, to spam her ults and follow-ups, and her lower amp compared to other premium harmonies and nihilities really starts showing. And Hyoscene, without lots of enemies to rely on for hit energy and reactive heals, loses a lot of damage and ult consistency. But, wouldn't you know it, Pure Fiction provides plenty of enemies for both of these AoE Amphorius units. This is a game mode in which they truly shine and can take just about any unit to new heights. Just to go back to before, the Casper synergy is obvious, but what's especially notable is how RMC can actually afford to buff all 3 of Casto, Tribbie, and Hyoscene at once for a no-limited Eidolon 0-cycle run. The Herta obviously loves Tribbie, and honestly likes high-speed Hyoscene if she can afford to use lots and lots of basics. Acheron benefits a lot from Hyoscene's S1, and so does Blade and Jingliu. Maide can utilize Wheelchair, especially at E0, to pick off the side mobs he could never target on his own. And of course, E1 just improves his performance overall. And those are just the ideal synergies. Heck, you could probably slot in Sunday, go full DPS Hyoscene, and still get an amazing score. Wheelchair is just that strong against a perma 5 enemy scenario, especially with E1 Tribbie. But that's also the thing, right? So many units rely on the highest unit Tribbie combo, or on Tribbie at the very least, for top tier pure fiction performance. What makes the Herta so special is that she does not. Granted, she does want E1 Robin at minimum for Tribbie-less zero cycling pure fiction at this point, but when your competition is E2 Finon, E2 Fugue, and E2 Casters teams, that seems like a pretty good deal to me. And that brings us back to pure fiction's top meta strategies today. AoE Nukers with competent sub-DPS, able to take lots of actions, with honorable mention niches in break action advanced spam, and overwhelming single target should you vertically invest enough. But honestly speaking, most players won't be reliably using the last two strategies as they are just that, niches. Their futures aren't exactly guaranteed after all. Break in particular has been in quite the sticky situation in pure fiction. Rappa, its best performer, has been hard tied to imaginary weakness, and the 50% toughness penalty for hitting off element really screws her over. Himiko is no different either. She's heavily dependent on fire weakness lest she face the same 50% toughness penalty with Fugue. But why wasn't this a problem before? Well, let's check the recommended weakness types in pure fiction before Rappa's release. As you can see, every single stage pre-Rappa had at least one fire weak side, letting Himiko consistently shine. The nearly back-to-back streak of Firefly into Lingsha into Jiao Cho certainly helped matters, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that Fire Week was going to be a constant going into the future. And by extension, since Lingsha can help Rappa build up her stacks, Rappa was looking like a promising unit too, so long as we had the Vidyadhara and healer on the team. 2.6 and 2.7 continue the Fire Week streak, only to completely rug pull it starting and continuing in 3.0. Sure, like one or two elites or bosses are Fire Week, but let's be real, that's not enough for Himiko or Lingsha to put in any meaningful work. At least Rappa has it much better with more consistent imaginary weaknesses, but as you can see, when fire and imaginary are gone, both our break DPS suffer immensely. And sure, you can still zero cycle pure fiction with both of them, but there's a reason why all of their zero cycles with break nowadays involve E2 Fugue plus Ron Mei. For one, E1 Fugue plus Ron Mei stacks 100% weakness break efficiency, which is super important for DPS with 10 toughness follow-ups and 20-10 skills in Himiko's case, and 7 to 37 toughness enhanced basic in Rappa's case. And 2, E2 Fugue's ult plays double duty. First, obviously, by being a 1 turn or less DDD to make zero cycling possible by virtue of pseudo-infinite turns, but also secondly, it refunds Fugue 3 energy per break, which, with a 20 colorless AoE toughness ult and exo break, lets her potentially double break enemies and kill them, refunding up to 11 energy per enemy defeated. This is what enables her 1 turn ult in the first place, and of course set ult spam fuels Himiko's follow-ups and Rappa's charge stacks, in addition to Harmony MCs or Tribbie's own energy generation. What's better than one DGD holder? Why 2, of course? And well, until you get to E6ing, there isn't any real way to further these teams, besides the one-time Harmony Battle Pass cone purchase in the shop right now. And well, with where Pure Fiction is setting the mob's toughness bars at the moment, I don't have high hopes for Break's future in Pure Fiction. Not to mention that we barely have any elites or bosses in the new rotation, which hurts Himiko and Rappa, who have damage and energy bonus for elites being broken. Also, just for fun, here's a chart of trash can toughness inflation. I think it's a funny litmus test for how toughness has gradually increased over time. Okay, so that's Break's issues. What exactly is wrong with single target then? Why can't it just target down the main boss? Well, as mentioned earlier, 2 words, Wave 1. For Wave 1, single target focused characters just can't deal enough hits to efficiently kill 20 enemies without spending a significant amount of time, or relying on a sub DPS like Tribbie or Hyacine. However, there's also the fact that elite and boss HP has been increasing at a frankly alarming rate, with bosses having gained 5 million HP since Grit first started. If HP keeps increasing more and more like this, then eventually direct boss damage won't matter as much and damage to the adds will. So naturally that means that Seela can take over as a hunt that specializes in killing adds, right? Well, with AoE being able to damage 4 mobs at once, compared to Blast 2 and single targets 1, and also not being resurgence reliant in the face of HP inflation, it isn't really a contest as to who wins at that point. And heck, if you want a single target brute force in the first place, let's not forget the absolute overkill damage collection menace that is Tribbie's E1, an Eidolon that only provides his crazy double or more multiplier to AoE units that can overkill up to 4 targets at once and transfer that damage to a different, still alive target all in the same move. Single target can't do either of those things. But what about E2 Finon's brute force potential? With the exception of DOT, which is shield right now, isn't he dominating Pure Fiction Zero cycles at the lowest Tribbie-less cost? Well, yes, but he's also a massive sufferer of single target diminishing returns. Every single one of his hits is bounced, with his final hit literally evenly spreading its 450% attack multiplier across all enemies, no matter what. Pretty much exactly like Anaxa's skill. Sure, the 16 bounces of 45% attack on his enhanced meteor means that he's less likely to waste damage on overkilling, but that 450% multiplier at the end being shared across all targets means if your damage is a bit short, where 4 bounces kill adjacent mobs instead of 3, your final AoE will be wasted on adjacent targets and your single target output will end up decreasing by around 60%. Of course, there is still value in finishing off adjacent mobs, but this should hopefully show how strict the breakpoints for meeting Finon's damage are, that are especially relic dependent. And unfortunately, despite being free from Tribbie, none of his best teams use Tribbie at the moment either, so yeah. Better hope he has good relics or his meteors might just start feeling like pebbles. Honestly, now that I think about it, this is probably why most AoE nukers have bounce damage profiles, break dependencies, or reliance on teammates for energy in the first place. It makes even minor upgrades to their team via amp, rotation, or toughness respectively, potentially game-changing, and at the same time, even minor hindrances to those mechanics devastating. And in both cases, the method and solution are both the same. Pull Eidolons or pull new units. Either way you're pulling. Though credit where credit is due, Pure Fiction has done a good job at times of shilling new units, while also giving undervalued units meta-wise a chance to shine on a semi-regular basis. The old Pure Fiction cycled between Shatter, Follow-Up Attack, and Dot buffs, completing this full cycle 3 times before moving on to the new version. There was one break chill as well, but it's the exception that proves the rule in my opinion. As such, Pure Fiction saw times where everyone succeeded, with Alt Shatter being good universally, times where the top performers dominated even harder, with follow-up attack buffs matching up with Pure Fiction's already top counters, and times when underperforming niches had a chance, like Dot and Break, through having their backloaded nature shored up through enemy action advance and front-loaded damage respectively. So while you can't count on everyone doing well consistently, at some point almost every unit will have a chance to shine, or at the very least, pass with the right team structure. The same can be said for the new Pure Fiction, just with its different chill bases, the universal highs being even higher, and the lows being even lower. As of now, grit can be collected via kills always, plus 5 grit per kill, and conditionally, skills, ults, basics, and recently, DOTs. The selectable buffs expand this roster to follow-up attacks, breaks, and HP loss as well. So without exaggeration, every single archetype has had at least one buff catered specifically to them. In tandem with these flavor of the month rotations, the selectable buffs have always generally branched into 3 categories: a non-restrictive buff, helping unfavored units catch up, a shill buff helping the rate up units win even harder, and a niche buff, meant for experimental teams or playstyles. But all of these buffs are just that, flavors of the month. When his skills actually cost SP, and the PF buffs can't give him 2 extra rotations, Anaxa's SP-hungry nature and complete lack of off-turn damage besides his relatively weak AoE, and low attack frequency as far as Thirda supports go, starts to show. And sure, Dot as of right now has all the buffs lined up in its favor to Zero Cycle, thanks to being able to proc Surging Grit insanely quickly, enemies being 50% faster during it, plus 20% res pen and 99% ramping vuln in all their dots, and also having a ramp up dot on them for free just in general. But what happened to their clear speed when, all of that goes away? Even Rappa and Himiko depend on the action advance on break buffs for dominant Pure Fiction showcases, able to perform near infinite loops with their assistance. When their buff rotations disappear, so does their dominance. Unless you're the Herta, in which case have fun doing your usual thing, I guess. With all that said, it's honestly a bit baffling to me at this point that some people still don't put respect on Pure Fiction's name. All 3 endgame modes give the same rewards and Pure Fiction is no exception. In fact, due to its inflexible nature, I'd say that by far, Pure Fiction can be the hardest to max clear of the game modes, should you not have its very specific right answers of AoE Nuke and Pure AoE Mix, usually with a touch of Tribbie too. MOC constantly changes its demands, meaning that older rosters often get chances to shine again when their characteristics line up, and often to a much higher degree than in Pure Fiction. Even Apocalyptic Shadow is no longer the break-focused mode it used to be, and even its top tiers had checks or were occasionally outclassed back when it was. Heck, they now have a DOT shield stage with Fei Xiao on the horizon, an archetype that used to see this stage as its greatest hell. That being said, there is some generosity in limiting the HP inflation mostly to Wave 3. Passing Wave 2 guarantees a 24k point baseline instead of the previous iteration's 20k, giving more leeway to the other side. And the replacement of trotters with trash cans means that teams no longer have to worry about upwards of 4 to 5k points running away with unlucky CCs or rotation timings. So long as you have one strong team, then your passing rate should be secure, especially seeing how relatively inflexible the top meta has been. A constant game mode can be boring, but it is just as much stable, at least until they decide to revamp Pure Fiction, if ever. But regardless of whatever external buffs or blessing mechanics they generate, now that Pure Fiction's gone through its growth stage and firmly established its identity as a 5-target AoE with single target focused game mode, there is one thing that remains constant for the time being. Madame Herta is a peerless gem. Madame Herta is an unrivaled genius. Madame Herta is an inimitable beauty. I can't wait for this sentiment to age like absolute trash. Thanks for watching.